Standing Up Against Anti Semitism explores Jewish lived experiences in Canada, the dimensions and complexities of anti Semitism, and how we can understand and work against anti Semitism as anti racist educators within FSL teaching contexts. The content of this series for both modules, anti Semitism and Islamophobia, may be sensitive for some individuals. The intention is not to offend nor encourage any forms of bias. Rather, the goal is in effort to support reconciliation, understanding, and peace, and to help enable educators to have conversations with students, colleagues, and other individuals. Moreover, it's intended to educate and inform teachers about the history and experiences of both Jewish and Muslim communities, both in Canada and internationally where relevant, from an impartial lens focused on professional development of self and pedagogy. I'm your host for Module 2. My name is Penny Rabiger, and I'm a researcher exploring the experiences of teachers leading anti-racism efforts in their schools in England. I grew up and studied in the UK, then taught English and citizenship in schools in Jerusalem, Israel, for 12 years. I've worked since 2007 in London, England, in leadership positions in a number of education organisations, and currently work freelance, training teachers on anti-racism alongside my full-time PhD studies. While you take part in this module, you might want to have a pen and paper to hand, or to create a Google document on which you log your thoughts and feelings. We'd like to invite you to reflect on 4 questions before we get going. 1. Are you aware of any policies and practices already in place in your educational setting to address anti-Semitism? 2. How might learning about anti-Semitism impact on you personally and professionally? 3. Do you have a feel for how anti-Semitism impacts individuals and communities in your setting? 4. Preparing you for the next section, reflect on the following. As a person living and teaching in Canada, what are your own understandings of Jewish populations? What knowledge do you currently have on the topic of French-speaking Jewish populations? Part 1. Context and History. Jews in Canada and beyond. In this section, we'll be looking at Jews in Canada and beyond. Jews in Canada. As of 2023, the world's core Jewish population, those identifying as Jews above all else, was estimated at 15.7 million, which is approximately 0.2% of the 8 billion worldwide population. Jewish people make up under 1% of the Canadian population. The Canadian census has only recently asked about Jewish heritage. While some people reported Jewish as their religion, some reported Jewish as their ethnic or cultural origin. In 2021, 282,000 people reported Jewish as their ethnic or cultural origin, compared with 144,000 in 2016, when Jewish was not an example listed with the question. Judaism as a religion is what is known as non-proselytizing, which means, unlike some other faiths like Christianity and Islam, it does not seek to convert others to the religion. It is possible to convert, but this is a long and complicated process which is not open to many. To qualify as Jewish, therefore, whether that is a religious or cultural or ethnic affiliation, it's usually agreed that your mother must be Jewish. However, some people do identify as Jewish if their father is Jewish and their mother is not. Where did Jews come from? Most of the early Jews that followed after the first recorded Jews came over came from or via Western and Central Europe. However, Jews come from a wide range of nationalities, ethnicities, racial backgrounds, and cultural traditions. Those identifying as Jewish will be both religious and non-religious. Since biblical times, cultural and linguistic differences have existed between Jewish communities. Since biblical times, Jews have experienced persecution for their faith and customs. There are many ways to be religious Jewish, and there are many streams, strands, practices, and levels of orthodoxy that Jewish people follow. What do Jews in Canada look like? What does a Jew look like? All these are Jewish people. They look like anyone. Jews are religious and non-religious. They can be any nationality or racialized identity. Early beginnings of Jewish immigration to Canada. The first known Jews to settle in the land we now call Canada were Samuel Jacobs and Aaron Hart, commissaries attached to the British Army during the British conquest of New France in 1760. Before that, Jewish immigration was banned in New France. They settled in Trois-Rivières, Quebec. Most of the early Jews that followed came from or via Western or Central Europe, and they also settled in Quebec. Let's look at the images of Jewish people clockwise from top left. The first image you see is Jewish men visiting the Wailing Wall in Israel. The second, Yemenite Jewish women, a photograph by Tamar Aharon. The third, Ethiopian Jews. The fourth is Annamie Paul, the first Canadian Jewish female party leader. The fifth is a father and daughter who are Indian Jews. The sixth shows Lev Tahor, a Jewish sect that spent some time in Canada before fleeing to Guatemala. And the seventh, Canadian Moroccan Jewish community members, often francophones. Jewish faith and the Torah. There's a saying among Jewish people that when you have two Jews together, you already have three opinions. What this means is that sometimes things are not as simple as we'd think, and that there is disagreement among Jewish people themselves around many day-to-day things that concern the Jewish experience. This is because a rich tradition in Jewish life is the act of seeking out different opinion, wanting debate and new perspectives. Religious Jewish men who study Torah, the Bible, do so alongside a set of books which give different interpretations of the texts, specifically for this reason, and you can see a man studying in this way in the picture. Men also study in small groups and debate the meanings of the teachings. In fact, a sign of intelligence for Jews is often said to be someone who can ask good questions. The definition of the word Torah is literally instruction. And when Jews say Torah, they're most likely speaking of the 5 books of Moses, the foundation of all Jewish instruction and guidance. It's also called the Chumash, from the Hebrew Chamesh, which means 5, just like the not-so-Jewish and somewhat archaic title Pentateuch, which comes from the Greek prefix penta, also meaning 5. Often, when people talk about a Torah, they are referring to a parchment scroll version of the 5 books of Moses that's kept in the Ark of the synagogue and taken out to be read during services. Some ways religious Jews practice their faith. Religious and non-religious Jews practice their faith in different ways. But here are just some of the basic things that many Jewish people do if they are religious. Belief in the teachings of the Old Testament and belief in one God. Ultra-Orthodox Jewish men are expected to learn Torah, or the Bible, throughout their lives as a primary occupation. Religious Jews observe Shabbat, or the Sabbath, from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. During Shabbat, prayers are said at home and candles are lit on a Friday night. There is a prayer said on a loaf of bread and on wine too, and a meal is usually eaten with family. No work, cooking, driving, use of fire or electricity is permitted until sundown Saturday. Some will attend the Jewish place of worship, a synagogue or shul, for prayer service during Shabbat and other religious festivals. Religious men are expected to attend prayers at a synagogue 3 times a day throughout the year. Shabbat is a time to rest and reflect. Praying regularly enables a person to get better at building their relationship with God. Jews will observe a number of other religious festivals throughout the year, and the calendar is a moon calendar rather than the Western sun calendar, which means these festivals fall at slightly different times of year. Jewish children come of age at 13 and will have a bar mitzvah for boys or bat mitzvah for girls to mark the occasion. Religious boys and men cover their head with a small skull cap called a kippah or a yarmulke. Married religious women may cover their heads with a hat, a headscarf, or a wig. Similarly, modest dress is a feature for children, men and women who are religious. Some Jewish people have very specific clothing that is related to their particular religious group. This might include black robes and particular style of hat for men and boys, for example. Some Jews follow food laws called kosher law. This means not eating pork or shellfish and not mixing milk and meat in the same meal, and in some cases, not eating food or using products that were produced during Shabbat. Jewish boys are circumcised in a ceremony which takes place when they are 8 days old. This ceremony is important for many Jewish people as it is a symbol of the covenant that God made with Abraham, and many non-religious and non-practicing Jews will circumcise their boys. Non-religious Jews may keep any or all of these traditions or none. They may also marry within the Jewish faith, believing this is a good way to keep their lineage going. Canadian Jewish History Timeline. When you look for Jewish history timelines, they often start with 1929, anti-Semitism, and the pre-Second World War period. However, a correct timeline would decouple Jews from European heritage and the Holocaust. Jews escaped persecution and sought better lives elsewhere through trade routes and other means since biblical times, coming from Spain and Portugal, Sephardic Jews, Iraq, Iran, Morocco, Yemen, Kurdistan, and many other European and non-European countries, as seen on the map in the previous slide. These Jews are often referred to as Mizrahi Jews or Sephardic Jews, or even Arab Jews. During the lead up to and following the Second World War period, the numbers of Jews from Europe increased. The Holocaust marked a turning point for many Jews and non-Jews with regards to the extent that anti-Semitic persecution could take. It was also perceived as extremely shocking, not least because it happened in Europe, which was deemed to be more forward-thinking than other parts of the world, and perhaps somewhere where this sort of thing was unthinkable. Today, the size of Canadian Jewish community is estimated to be between 340,000 and 380,000, a little more than 1% of the total population of 31.3 million. Most Canadian Jews reside in Ontario and Quebec, followed by Manitoba, British Columbia, and Alberta. Approximately 180,000 Jews live in Toronto, 93,000 in Montreal, 22,600 in Vancouver, 14,800 in Winnipeg, 13,500 in Ottawa, 8,000 in Calgary, and 5,000 in both Edmonton and Hamilton. By the 1990s, Canada had become the 4th largest diaspora community, and today it's the 3rd, preceded by Israel and the USA. How are Jews protected under Canadian law? In 1831, Jews were granted the same political rights as Christians in Canada. Today, Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms, along with provincial and territorial human rights laws, provide for the right to equality and prohibit discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, and religion. The Supreme Court of Canada recognises that a sincerely held personal religious belief was to be accommodated through being permitted to wear what's known as religious garb in public and being able to request leave of absence for religious observance. Where does Israel fit in? We've established that Jews have lived all over the globe for centuries. Jews lived in Palestine as a minority group for hundreds of years alongside other populations and through different conquests and empires. The Ottoman Empire ruled from 1517 until 1917 when Palestine was conquered by the British. The map on the left shows which territories were Palestinian in 1917. The region was ruled over by the British Mandate for Palestine until 1948, when the Jewish state of Israel was proclaimed part of Palestine. See the 1948 map. This was made possible by a Christian Zionist and later Jewish Zionist movement and its efforts over many decades to convince Jews to immigrate to Israel. Jews were not keen on this idea for hundreds of years and did not immigrate in significant numbers, preferring to integrate into other countries worldwide. However, following the Second World War and the Jewish Holocaust, with many countries still hostile to and restricting Jewish immigration from Europe and other areas of the world, the new Jewish state of Israel seemed to promise hope and safety and economic security for some Jewish people. Today, 60% of Jewish people in Israel are from the non-European diaspora mentioned earlier, Mizrahi, Sephardi populations from Iran, Iraq, Morocco, and so on, as well as from Ethiopia, and would not have been directly affected by the Holocaust in Europe. However, Israel is often seen as a European outpost in the Middle East and was declared as intentioned in this way when it was founded. So this notion of Jews as European descendants has been cultivated also to serve this aim. The Jewish state of Israel has forcibly displaced huge populations of Palestinian people since it was founded in 1948. People who have been resisting the settlement on and colonization of their land ever since. Gaza is the most overpopulated area in the world, with communities there held under occupation in what has been described as a huge open prison, denied basic rights, the right to elections and self-determination. Hamas, supported by Israel, has been the elected government since 2006, but Israel has not allowed elections since. The group is widely deemed as a terrorist organization by countries worldwide. It is not clear to what extent their rule is supported by Gazans. Over the last 76 years, there have been many wars, gradual reduction of Palestinian territories and freedoms through legal and illegal means. The map shows from left to right what is left of the Palestinian territories under Israeli occupation. The Israeli population is 9.5 million and the Palestinian population in Palestine territories was 5 million before the Gaza war. There have been some attempts over the years to find a peaceful solution, including a two-state solution, but these have repeatedly failed. On October 7th, 2023, led by Hamas, armed men entered land in the state of Israel from Gaza in a planned attack. They murdered 763 civilians, including children, and 373 serving Israeli security personnel, and took 250 people hostage, around 100 of whom are still held hostage today. Since October the 7th, Israel's army has been engaged in large-scale bombardment of Gaza, which has been described as a genocide, killing over 40,000 Palestinian civilians, including women and children, and wounding many, many more. 50% of the population of Gaza, and therefore fatalities and casualties, are children. Where are Palestinians and Jews today? Jews worldwide and Palestinian Muslims and Christians share a history of displacement and diaspora. Reflection exercise. What's your family's diaspora story? Do you know how your family came to Canada or to Ottawa from other parts of Canada? When? And what were the drivers for this? Some important distinctions. It should be really clear then. Jews are not from Israel, now or in the past. Maybe the majority were until the 6th century BCE. Some Jews went to Israel in significant numbers to settle directly following the Second World War and have continued to do so since. 60% of the Jewish population in Israel are non-European descendant Jews. This is all significant information because when conceptualizing Jewish people, popular notions are to view Jews as white, European descendants and linked to Israel. The belief that modern-day Israel is the land of the Jews and that Jews have what is known as a right of return and to live there is called Zionism. It is a commonly understood fact that Zionism is predicated on replacing the Palestinian population with a Jewish population, and this has been described as settler colonialism. Settler colonialism differs from other forms of colonialism where the existing population was exploited for labor. In the case of the State of Israel, Palestinians are not deemed as necessary to the economy, and this makes the relationship different from other forms of colonialism. The USA, Canada, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand are also settler colonial nations. Many more Jews live in other parts of the world than live in Israel. Some Jews believe that Zionism has a place in the Jewish experience. Some do not believe this. Some have no opinion on this question at all, and modern-day Israel does not feature in their formation of a Jewish identity. Jews have been conceptualized as white and European. This is a flawed understanding, but it also guides some of the reasons why anti-Semitism sometimes gets framed the way it does. We'll come back to this a bit later. It's time to pause and reflect. 1a. Thinking back to the reflective exercise about your family's diaspora, how can this knowledge and awareness help you better understand where your students come from and with whom they are still connected? 1b. Connecting back to the second module of the first series, what does this say about our positionalities, specifically for those that are non-Indigenous? 2. On a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being a beginner and 5 very informed, how would you rank your understanding of this information in part 1? Share one thing that surprised you most and explain why. 3. How can you deepen your knowledge on anti-Semitism in Canada as an FSL educator? Which resources or organisations are you familiar with? Part 2. What is anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism is racism. There's no one definition of anti-Semitism. However, Canada has adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance (IHRA) definition of anti-Semitism as follows. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. It seems straightforward enough. However, there are forms of racism which are expressed and experienced in different ways. There's a lot of talk about and confusion about anti-Semitism these days, especially in light of the ongoing actions of the State of Israel, which have intensified since the brutal Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October and the response by the Israel Defense Force. The widely accepted definition of anti-Semitism by the IHRA can be helpful to an extent, but is widely rejected as problematic by many scholars, universities, and others, as it conflates being Jewish with loyalty to Israel and conflates anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. You can be Israeli, Jewish, and deeply anti-Zionist in that you don't accept that a homeland for Jews in Israel should result in the erasure of non-Jews for it to be a success. Anti-Semitism is racism, microaggressions. Remember we said earlier that Jews have been conceptualized as white and European. This is a flawed understanding, but it also guides some of the reasons why anti-Semitism sometimes gets framed the way it does. Expressions of racism follow a pattern which is easy to recognize. You will know about microaggressions from your previous anti-racism training. Here are just a handful that might be said to a Jewish person. They might even be said by a Jewish person to another Jewish person due to internalized stereotyping or racism. Underpinnings of racism. To understand anti-Semitism as a form of racism, you need to understand racist formations and how these work to create notions of human, less human, non-human, and superhuman. Racist stereotyping can activate all of these, sometimes at the same time. Racism shifts and changes over time, reforming itself to fit current situations while drawing on often accepted truths, in inverted commas, which are deeply flawed. However, it's worth noting how those educating about anti-Semitism often draw on exceptionalism to explain why Jews are particularly persecuted over and above other groups. One of the ways of doing this is narratives around the Holocaust as a particularly terrible thing because it happened in Europe, and the subtext being that these sorts of things happen in so-called non-Western or non-European contexts, but are unimaginable in white European populations. This is anti-Black racism in action. Operationalize notional whiteness to create a hierarchy of acceptable and unacceptable racism. For this reason, many people refer to anti-Jewish racism rather than anti-Semitism. It's not the case that one is better or more appropriate than the other. Rather, we need to understand when using language what language does, and therefore we need to make choices accordingly. These will be based on context and our own understanding. Trigger warning. For this section, we issue a trigger warning. We'll delve into some specifics around what anti-Jewish racism looks like. This is important as we need to understand these to not only understand anti-Semitism, but to help differentiate between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. Racism, punching up and punching down. When we think about punching up, here are some of the ways that Jews are seen as powerful, and therefore racist notions about them are seen as justified ways to lash out at the powerful, hence the term punching up. Jews killed Jesus. God created Hitler to punish Jews. This seems like a logical narrative to some. Religious anti-Semitism. Jews are seen as pagans, child killers, and sacrificers. There are many myths, tropes, legends, and stories which play to this. The blood libel myth. This refers to the false allegation that Jews use the blood of non-Jewish, usually Christian, children for ritual purposes. Jews are rich and powerful. Many people don't realize that this is a myth. Even many Jews believe it to be true. Statistically, 46% of American Jews earn over $100,000 a year. However, if we understand that this group is predominantly comprised of Ashkenazi or European descendant, white, educated Jews, so their wealth is in line with other white middle-class groups and a result of racial and class disparities in the USA. In ultra-Orthodox Jewish populations, poverty is rife, as men tend to study Torah and women are responsible for childcare and are the primary breadwinners. 44% of ultra-Orthodox Jewish families in Israel live in relative poverty, which is double the rate of the general Jewish population in Israel, for example. Jewish control of the media, economies, political arena. Again, this is usually based on a disproportionate number of white, middle, and upper class groups who control these arenas and where Jews benefit from being conceptualized as white, if it is a thing at all. Great replacement theory, the notion that Jews are trying to take over the world. As it's a non-proselytizing faith, they definitely aren't trying to convert anyone. Punching up and punching down. Punching down. Jews are seen as genetically defective. Jews are seen as ugly, having big noses, depicted in pictures as animals and subhuman. Compared to animals, common tropes include snakes that can't be trusted, an octopus trying to take over the world, or spiders spinning a web for the same reason. Holocaust denial, saying it didn't happen, and if it did, then the numbers affected are wildly overstated. Using conspiracy theories and tropes, swapping out Israel for Jew, holding all Jews responsible for actions of Israel, assuming Jews are Israelis or loyal to Israeli state and disloyal to Canada. It's interesting to note how these happen across other racialized groups too. Muslim populations and Black, Indigenous people of color often are held responsible for the actions of those perceived to be part of their group. And again, these groups are often assumed to be disloyal to Canada or their religion, ethnicity, before their nationality and citizenship. Pause and reflect. It's time to pause and reflect. 1. Reflect on an experience that you have encountered with regards to racism and anti-Semitic tropes in an educational setting. Where do some of these show up internally, interpersonally, and in educational institutions? 2. How do you engage in these conversations in an FSL context? 3. Which challenges can you foresee? How do they manifest in both the classroom and in a wider school setting? Part 3. Standing up against anti-Semitism in the current climate. Is it anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism? As we said earlier, the widely accepted definition of anti-Semitism by the IHRA can be helpful to an extent, but is widely rejected as problematic by many scholars, universities, and others, as it conflates being Jewish with loyalty to Israel and conflates anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. We said you can be Israeli, Jewish, and deeply anti-Zionist, in that you don't accept a homeland for Jews in Israel should result in the erasure of non-Jews for it to be a success. How to tell if it's anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism is pretty straightforward if you think back to the punching up and punching down list. There are Zionist critics of Israeli government policies, such as the occupation of the West Bank, the route of the separation barrier, which Israel is building in and around the West Bank, and which it says is for security against Palestinian attackers, though Palestinian supporters see it as a device to grab land, and the building of settlements. There are also Israeli Jewish critics of Zionism, and of course non-Israeli Jewish critics of Zionism. Jewish opposition to the Zionist movement started long before the State of Israel was declared in 1948. Today, fringe ultra-Orthodox groups such as the Neturei Karta oppose the State of Israel. See the picture on the far left, because they believe the true Jewish state will only be established with the coming of the Messiah. Likewise, some people make the point that Zionism is a political project supported by plenty of non-Jews, including Western governments and many United States evangelical Christians. Is it anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism? Identifying and differentiating. At times, people use anti-Semitic tropes to make their point of criticism about the Israeli government's actions in Gaza or about the state of Israel's right to exist. It's important to know how to identify when this is happening and to know how to differentiate. Which of these statements do you think is true? 1. Criticism of Israel, similar to that levelled against any other country, cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. 2. When Jews are verbally or physically harassed, or Jewish institutions and houses of worship are vandalized in response to actions of the State of Israel, it is anti-Semitism. The American Jewish Committee. 3. When people criticize Zionists, they mean Jews. You're talking anti-Semitism. Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. The first two are definitely true. The third is not always true, but that's why it's important for us as educators to know how to interrupt discussion. If people are using tropes and stereotypes about Jews to make their point about Zionism, then the way they're making their point is anti-Semitic. Anti-Zionism is opposition to the foundation of a state of Israel, which necessitates the erasure of one ethnic group for the survival of another ethnic group. Most anti-Zionists call for a state of Israel which is a democratic nation that serves the interests of all who live there. As Avram Berg, former Speaker of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, said in 2018, Israel must belong to all of its residents, including Arabs, not to the Jews alone. Anti-Semitism isn't wrong because it's wrong to denigrate and dehumanize Jews. Anti-Semitism is wrong because it is wrong to denigrate and dehumanize anyone, which means ultimately that any effort to fight anti-Semitism that contributes to the denigration and dehumanization of Palestinians is no fight against anti-Semitism at all. Peter Baynard, City University of New York. Resisting anti-Semitism is not political. You don't need to have all the answers or need to understand the whole history of the Jews or of Zionism, but you do need to be able to interrupt racism to dismantle it. So all knowledge is powerful towards this aim. Our role as educators is to seek out knowledge and facilitate informed dialogue. Pause and reflect. 1. Share one fact that you learned about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitic tropes. 2. How would you explain to someone in your place of work the difference between the two? 3. In what ways does having this information make it easier to engage meaningfully with the topic of standing up against anti-Semitism? How can your programming support the amplification of voices of French-speaking Jews? Part 4. Standing up against anti-Semitism in education. Why did we never learn this? Preparing educators to teach for justice and equity on days after. Alyssa Hadley Dunn. So, how do we proceed? It's important to give some hope and some practical solutions rather than just a diatribe railing against all forms of racism. I want to draw on a useful conceptual framework called Days After Pedagogy, developed in the USA and which is deployed to center perspectives of equity and justice in the days after major events, traumas and tragedies at local, state, national and international level. The key principles are 1. A commitment to justice and equity. 2. Student-centered and humanizing interactions and spaces. 3. Risk-taking. 4. Adaptability and flexibility. 5. Socio-political awareness. And 6. Vulnerability. When teachers, curricula, and schools are able to work through these principles, they're able to resist silence in the face of oppression, refuse neutrality, reclaim voice and agency for themselves and their students, and teach towards transformation. This comes from a book which is summarized by the journal article, Why Did We Never Learn This? Preparing Educators to Teach for Justice and Equity on Days After by Alyssa Hadley Dunn. Why did we never learn this? Preparing educators to teach for justice and equity on Days After. How can Days After pedagogy help you with the Israel-Palestine anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism situation, or any other situation which arises? Refusing silence and refusing neutrality. So the first step would be to ask students what they think they know already and what they would like to know more about. Using Paulo Freire's principle of encouraging problem posing, not rushing towards problem solving, will be helpful here. Reclaim voice and agency for yourself and students. Step 2. Group the what we know and what we want to know into clear themes and gather 10 distinct lines of inquiry. Step 3. Form a working party with a remit, clear time and space to meet regularly, terms of engagement to ensure safety and care are prioritised, but silencing is not an option, and start to research answers to the things we don't know and fact-check assumptions we think we do know. Reassure the students that we're going to all learn and develop our understanding together over time. The situation is dynamic, and so are we. Teach towards transformation. Everyone will be transformed through this process. Step 4. Tell your students that together you'll find answers, perspectives, and ways of understanding based on what you've captured from them, and that together over a period of time, you will have a series of constructive and courageous conversations. If we want balance, critical thinking, and to prime our young people to be able to go deep, think wisely, and feel hope, we need to model this and do it over time. Not one lesson. Not shut it down completely, not write to your local politician lesson. The young are our future. We must believe in them and allow them to co-create the future in the present. Toolkit: Creating supportive school culture to counter anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. This toolkit for countering anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in schools is relevant and useful. It was used in the session you did on Islamophobia, so let's quickly recount. You cannot do this work without creating a culture of dialogue in your classrooms. If you shut down conversation, you will drive racism underground. Toolkit 1. Build inclusive classroom culture, exploring all Jewish communities. On point 2, given what we have learned about representation across the diverse Jewish communities, when you involve Jewish students to create displays and curate books, you may find that you can even open your Jewish students' eyes to the non-European descendant Jewish communities. Toolkit 2. Build competency. Reflect on your own biases, identities, and perspectives. Educators need to recognize their own perspectives and biases, reflect on their own identities, and begin to understand how those impact on their own competencies within certain critical topics. Toolkit 2. Build competency to facilitate difficult conversations. Reflective exercises. If you're unsure how to begin this work, LFJ's Let's Talk guide has a few reflection activities to start. Think about the way that this is handled in the Days After pedagogy model as well. Toolkit 3. Strategies to address hate and bias. 4 strategies are interrupt, question, educate, and echo. Can you ask people to rethink and rephrase in a way that doesn't dehumanize? Can you ask people to contextualize their words within facts? And can you point out where tropes and stereotypes are being used to make a point? Can you ask your students to go away and look more deeply into what they're talking about? Can you draw on the Jewish tradition of small discussion groups alongside challenging texts to help us see different perspectives? These strategies have no specific order, though you might find yourself using multiple strategies together. Toolkit 4. Create a response plan. Before a crisis occurs, how can you and other school leaders assess your school's climate with an eye toward diffusing tension, preventing escalation, and avoiding problems? When there's a crisis or in the days after, what are the key points to consider when responding to a crisis that has been triggered by a bias incident at your school? After the worst is over, how can you address long-term planning and capacity building for the future, including development of social emotional skills? Key points. So to sum up some of the key points that we've learned through this module, we need to broaden our views on what it means to be Jewish as a starting point. Anti-Semitism is racism. It's important to understand what anti-Semitic racism looks like. Understanding the difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is key. Our role is to constantly educate ourselves so we can interrupt and dismantle racism. Build a classroom culture which supports these aims. I hope you found this session helpful and that you'll be able to follow up any further lines of inquiry which you can use in your classrooms. Thanks for your engagement and good luck.
Your support and feedback support the development of future professional learning series. Please take a moment to complete the following survey. Should you have any questions or comments about this module, please send an email to omlta@omlta.org. These modules were created under the leadership of the Ontario Modern Languages Teachers Association. The OMLTA is a non-profit professional association that has been supporting French as a second language and international languages teachers of all programs and grade levels since 1886. These modules were designed to support FSL teachers to becoming anti-racist FSL educators through the development of the foundations presented in this series so they may feel more comfortable, confident, and equipped to be equitable and inclusive in their second language learning classrooms in a manner that is sincere and authentic. The OMLTA would like to thank the Ministry of Education for its financial support in developing this module series. In addition, a special thanks goes to the educators who contributed their expertise and their experience to the creation and development of these modules.